Hi, and welcome to a somewhat philosophical episode of the Observation Deck. In this week's episode, I expand on the ideas from what we have come to understand about our not-so-historical history, as mentioned in my previous episodes. The covering up of fraudulent historical sites under the guise of restoration, to the deliberate injection of misinformation to muddy the waters within our schools' textbooks. This episode seeks to open the discussion to some of the questions we all want answers to and will probably spend most of our lives seeking them. It is always a creative risk to change what many have come to enjoy, but what would be the point of revealing all the deception if we were never going to explore any solutions? I will, of course, revert to exploring other aspects, since after all this is the observation deck, and the implication is we observe and comment on all things which affect our lives, and in some small part offer a doorway which we can sneak a peek at what could be. In essence, this is the grand game of life. Not this life, but all life everywhere. In reality, a journey which seeks to counteract the great reset of power-hungry few which started around the time we call the year 1, 2,000 years ago, while many say it was 1,000 years. But spending our time, which is a currency we cannot afford to squander, on what the date is simply a waste of time. With a slight change in this episode's approach, I simply want to open up debate, open minds to a universe of impossible possibilities, and encourage us all to work towards something better than we have now. The basis upon which we have been fed our reality will be brought into question in various ways, and I will endeavour to propose alternative ideas, simply as food for thought. So with that in mind, I'll see you on the other side. Hi and welcome. And I don't want to waste any of your time, so let me dive straight in. I want to start by giving you a quote from Amandio Diogenes, since it epitomizes the idea that truth is as colourful and as varied as nature itself. Human nature demands that beliefs acquired must be cherished and protected, be they ever so incomplete and faulty. My truth is the truth, so say we all. Thus, like the porcupine projecting its quills in sensing possible danger, the majority become automized into throwing against the new and unknown, and the oral quills of skepticism, cynicism, and ridicule, without even hearing values inherent in the new, are thrown to one side. They fear that the new might encroach upon or upset cherished beliefs born of nothing but whimsical speculation. And I tend to agree. Created reality is knowing what the mind can conceive, the body will believe. And masters of deception throughout history have known this basic fact for millennia. Reality is summed up in the physical by the input taken through our five senses. What we hear, see, touch, taste, and feel forms the basis of what we call reality. But of course, once we start to go deeper, we soon realize our perceptions, our imaginations can create a completely different idea of that reality. This can be clearly seen in cases of post-traumatic stress disorder and other such conditions. For those who live with such conditions of distorted reality are, in my humble opinion, the most sensitive of spiritual beings. The twist comes when we know our senses can be fooled. A bit like hypnosis and a trance-like suggestions which can create many realities to the entertainment of others. Our history is a series of constructed fables. Our media pumps out political ideas which are not in the best interest of those who place their representatives in power, and social media has become the stomping ground of abstract negative realities, and all working towards the goal of keeping the minds in a mental prison while the body is used as a profit-making machine for the few. That, for me, is the fractured reality in which we are encouraged to comply with, Division of heart and mind and spirit is encouraged in all forms of mass communication, as it was after the Great Reset. The saying, "Be careful what you wish for," started life as a curse. What it is saying is that which we think of the most, that which plays in the back of our minds, is what we create for ourselves. So be careful what you allow your unconscious to say or suggest in the back of that mind of yours. But this episode is not about the complaints of those who see through the lies, the distortions of half-truths, or the deceptions of the past. For, if it were, we would be no further down the road of change than our forefathers. It has to be about the future, not the past, and yet it is our past, or at least the image we would make of it, that could act as a template for our future. The past that has been hidden, the unity of humanity prior to the Great Reset, which saw so many forgeries of history come into being. I have had many comments over the months asking my opinion on many subjects, and I hope many of those questions will be covered somewhat in this episode. I'd like to start with what we know. From Fomenko's work and that of Sir Isaac Newton and many others, you would have seen in my video on Historygate that we've had approximately 1,000 years added to our timeline. You would also have seen what I collectively call the grand cover-up, the removal and destruction of much of our ancient records, at least in written format. Additionally, we have looked at the vast amounts of sculptured copies adorning many of our historical establishments, which would easily conclude that these are fabricated chapters in our historical accounts of a world we really know very little about. This, along with the lost empires such as the Empire of Tartaria, creates empires such as the Greeks, who by all accounts have nothing to show but fragments and copies of their own history, could well be completely fabricated. All this points towards a collaboration of truly historic proportions and leaves us not with if it happened, since evidence from across the world indicates it did, but who and why history was rewritten, and what is so important that these entities have to hide what was and subject us to the fabrication that the current version of history clearly is. It is a challenging undertaking by anyone trying to fit the pieces of a jigsaw together without all the parts, to try and imagine a world with little to go on. I have kept a sort of reason for this discrepancy type of diary myself for many years, and it may take more than a single episode to explain the Grand Reset and the reasons I believe are the motivations behind it. Any foray into this quagmire of quasi-quotes is by its nature a mammoth task. The challenge is to know what has been altered, destroyed and suppressed in order for this version of reality to even exist. We know, for instance, free energy has been firmly placed on the do not enter list for the sake of energy company profits. We also know that mysterious energy domes and holographic halls of records have been sealed off by the world's military machines, working for the most part for themselves and not for liberty and freedom, but for slavery and suppression. But the suppression of what is the question? The ideology of all religious doctrines must also come under the scrutiny of the open mind, however emotive, since it is having faith in yourself that has been superseded by transferring faith to a faceless entity based on nothing more than hearsay and the written word of man. It is said that God created man in his own image, but if we are to maintain an open mind and have an adult discussion, then one must question the validity of such claims. If not, for the simple reason that within the vastness of unknowable eternal universe, we have no idea how many intelligent life forms exist or what they look like. Which leads me personally to conclude it is man who has created the idea of God in his own image. An image, when considering the universe, is a little blinkered to say the least, and one that keeps us from exploring beyond the confines of the human experience and condition. I mean, if you could imagine going on holiday to a new land and you were forced to follow the path of the tourist guide rather than explore this wondrous land for yourself. The guides insisting that only they can show you its wonders and you must obey and spend your entire holiday at the mercy of this guide. Life is a trip, and I do not want a guide since my proposed life is to discover it for myself. I believe we do not need or require a middleman to explore the grand game of life. We need an open heart and mind to explore a universe of impossible possibilities. My goal is not to offend those of faith, but to simply allow me and many others to explore what it means to be human. If anyone is offended by my asking questions, then I feel it is you that needs to reevaluate your idea of free will. Like the saying goes, I may not agree with your opinion, but I will fight side by side with you to allow us the freedom to have it. We know the education system has, since its inception, been a place of rules, regulations, and the training of an obedient mind. Not an open forum where minds are allowed to explore, question the established narrative, or contradict what has been given to us as truth. It is the basis for compliance to a system which seeks nothing more than control of mind and spirit. When we look at the space-based organizations across the world, underlying images of their logos depict the forked tongue. This is true of almost every space-based organization. It seems clear, irrespective of who is running the public show, a hidden entity or group is in total control. So what guidance can we take from the plethora of the deceptive reality we call life? What can we as individuals use as a metric to traverse the missing centuries and the hidden knowledge? In my humble opinion, and many will accuse me of an oversimplification, which may well be true, but in essence, in order to avoid getting stuck in the mud of so many threads of historical trickery, I'm going to use what I call flipping the coin. The smoke and mirrors used as distraction tools keeps us running around like headless goldfish swimming in a sea of confusion. Yet, if we take a moment to break down and stop the unconscious reflex to play this game of hide and seek the truth, we may well be able to pull apart the fibers of fraud and fiction that wrap our true nature and find out the king does not indeed have any clothes on. So, to begin, and with no particular order, we will take a journey towards the unknown by a brief overview of the known. Then, as I mentioned, we will flip the coin to the other side and, like all good magicians, take a look at the hand the wizard does not want us to pay attention to. Once we have taken samples of what we know, we can attempt to put together some ideas which I will present towards the end of the journey through the abyss we are forced to call reality. The question of what was contained within those missing centuries or the knowledge bases of our ancient ancestors will be addressed with a speculative account, since it cannot be anything else. But given what we have to work with or without, I suspect we can come close to realizing what sort of world and who the inhabitants were, and it may start to reveal itself to us all. Let us start with the idea that a mud flood did happen, or a massive earth change that created mud floods all over the planet. Now, many say this happened around about 1812 or thereabouts. Again, I don't want to get bogged down, excuse the pun, connected to mud flood. I don't want to get bogged down with the actual dates because we may never know for sure. But the world suffered a cataclysmic event that required millions of children to be transported around the world to repopulate those areas most affected. It would be an easy task to delete any memories of our past achievements given the younger generation had not yet lived long enough to understand the world as it was. More than this, those missing centuries prior to earth changes or human incompetence gives rise to a perfect opportunity to rewrite the modern world as we now see it. Many have mentioned reasons for this being power, greed, or just plain evil if such a concept is in fact a reality. But an even greater event could have left us with nothing more than a Stone Age level of knowledge prior to the 18th century or even earlier, which I suspect, about the mud floods we hear of. It would have afforded the opportunity to change completely the order of life. The change from an ordered, nature-compliant existence at balance with the earth to a managed system of capitalist greed and power. The reset is, in my opinion, the term used to initiate this negative rebranding of our world into what we see and experience today. And this would not be the first time in human history we were set back, considering those dark ages we may well have suffered from as an event that has now been reset by the writings of those Benedictine manuscript forgers to give an impression of a world centered around their own power structure, which is in all likelihood a complete fabrication. Those missing centuries Fomenko speaks of, those Egyptian pharaonic lines which are so conveniently forgot about by academia, which clearly shows lifespans of past rulers into the hundreds if not thousands of years, along with the bloodlines of Sumerian rulers, clearly indicate a longevity that surpasses our widest dreams of today. Brief mentions of giants, hidden evidence of the same and the lifespans of which are said to go with them, all of it suppressed, ignored or destroyed. So in this regard, we can certainly flip the coin and state with an amount of certainty our ancestors had much longer lifespans than we currently have. And with the missing centuries of knowledge, we could also assume one of two things. First, we had a great reset in a year yet to be determined and long before the reset of the mud flood, since the destruction of our concept of time itself was orchestrated and carried out and replaced with what is now sold as the Dark Ages. Due to the lack of evidence, while pushed to the brink of total knowledge deletion, it sent us back to something akin to farming the lands, loss of cultural memory, and a civilization trying to come to terms with an unwritten cataclysm, pushing us back to an almost Stone Age period. Certainly no form of energy was logged into the history books that survived. But then, how would we know when modern history tells us all our books were destroyed systematically with flood, fire and wars? This seems a perfect adjunct to deleting what was in favour of what now is claimed as history. The Dark Ages, as we have been told, seems to have been a time when everything, art, science, writing and human achievement simply disappeared. Which would make sense if we were rebuilding our civilization from the fragments that were left after a global catastrophe. Followed by the discovery, deletion and censorship of previous knowledge in order to bring about what we are told as the Renaissance period, which, as my viewers will know, is another word for medieval photocopying of fake history. We can continue to describe what the world may have been by looking at what has been taken or suppressed, and again flip the coin in an attempt to understand why and what could have been so dangerous it needed to be hidden from us all. I guess it raises one of the most fundamental questions, and that is, did this ancient world have the ability to generate free energy? Well, since we know that Tesla and many others have utilized forms of energy other than oil, it's pretty certain we did. Electrical Wi-Fi systems dating back thousands of years in the form of pyramids would not be out of place given the works of later Tesla and others as well. The old buildings with strange metal weather vanes, as we are told, could have conducted power to all parts of the buildings during the mud flood or prior to the mud flood period. Water and the splitting of oxygen and hydrogen has been patented, and so much more has been suppressed for nothing more than profit, which leads us directly into slavery by another name. So yes, we can assume with a fair amount of conviction our ancestors had as much free energy as they could ever need, and this alone would have changed the face of the world as we know it. Living in a world of free energy also reveals a world where a capitalist system is simply not required. Not only that, but a natural extension to such a world is a perfect environment to explore our art, culture, and the meaning of life stuff, since we would not be hungry and would not have to work on a chain gang wearing suits to give the impression we're not in a prison to the system. So what would a civilization do with all that spare time? What sort of things were they free to explore? Could it be that they were seeking the answers to some of the greatest questions that have been asked of humanity since the dawn of life itself? If we are not in a world kept busy by chasing profit, paying bills and being slaves to taxation of our efforts, what would you be able to do? While we see this current system as control and greed, if they were not present in the world prior to the Grand Reset, can you begin to imagine some of the pursuits of that civilization? Can you begin to imagine some of the pursuits you would have, not having to worry about food or shelter or energy? Let me move on to another clue that we know of and flip the coin to see what the opposing hand may be up to. The discoveries mentioned in other parts of my previous episodes concerning the subterranean world. The detail I want to bring to your attention out of those episodes is the claims of those who reported the discovery of many types of halls of records. We know of the fabled Hall of Records under the Giza Plateau, but what about the reports from Iraq in 2002 and Romania a few years after? Both said to have been protected by a dome of pure energy, and once this dome was breached, the military found themselves confronted with a holographic library of ancient knowledge. Who knows what wonders these repositories of wisdom held? Others have since reported this same situation is to be found in Mexico and the Grand Canyon. I am, for the sake of this episode, going to assume these discoveries are real and tell us of a far different way of imparting knowledge. Could it be our ancestors or advanced beings could literally download knowledge while we today are left with an analog approach of actually reading books? Could it be possible that our ancestors had moved, like we, from written words to a more advanced form in knowledge acquisition? No different from our move from pen to paper to the digital transfer of data. Imagine if you wanted a secure way of delivering data and you had the tools to do it. What if something that looked like a stone or a crystal sat on a shelf and only those with certain DNA could initiate the transfer of knowledge? It sure beats retina scans or fingerprints, and maybe this is where the idea of bloodlines first emerged. Painting a picture of a previous civilization is possible even with the fragments we have today. But our journey is far from over, and before I run the first recap on what we have so far, we move to the controversy of the Mandela effect. And why so controversial, you may ask? Well, simply put, it requires many of us to stretch our minds beyond the bounds of accepted norms. It shakes the foundations of a reality that's been superimposed upon us. There are simply some things we will not go beyond, and for many, the altering of time itself is one of them. For those of you who question the validity of such a phenomena, it may be helpful to understand that bending space and time, or time and space, may not be as fictitious as many believe. CERN and hundreds of locations like it across the world are all conducting the same experiments. Us mere mortals have no idea what the consequences are or the reasons for using such technology, and therefore how can we be absolute in our assumptions that nothing has been affected by it? Considering we have no idea what they found in those holographic Hall of Records or what technology they were able to back engineer, we are left with no more of a solid understanding of what is or is not possible than NASA going to the moon and then losing the data and the ability to do so. Why would I bring the Mandela effect into a discussion about ancient probabilities? Well, we have no idea how a massive global reset was initiated that caused what we call the Dark Ages, and this type of messing around or deliberate acts may well have been the cause. Since it is within our nature to explore, we may not always be aware of the consequences of opening up Pandora's box and breaching the veil of time and space itself. Let's be honest, we never really grow out of the let me stick my finger in that plug socket and find out what happens mentality. We just play with more complex and dangerous plug sockets. What about space travel and the efforts of various organisations across the world to explore outside of this realm or beyond our atmosphere? If we apply the flip the coin principle again, we may not be looking at space travel at all. That is not to say space doesn't exist, I have no idea, but simply do not trust any organisation that keeps faking so many images, videos and losing data, and has logos that clearly show an underlying group controlling all information on the subject. As with many of our public announcements, it is in the nature of a secretive government to propagate a facade for which the public looks upon, while conducting other explorations, some of which may seem too fantastical by normal standards. In this regard, I am referring to interdimensional travel, which also brings into mind the strange opening ceremonies of CERN. The existence of ghosts, as we call them, or entities mentioned in various religious texts, and the witnessed ability of what we call alien craft sightings to simply disappear from view. Add to this the early experiments we have come to know as the Philadelphia experiments, we can, with some degree, start to imagine more than a linear form of travel from one point to another, which is what the space program would have us believe at this moment in time. Taken as a collective, the idea of interdimensional travel and exploration, and not the linear space-to-space theories put forth for the most part with Einstein's theory of general relativity, which, by the way, had to delete any references to the discovery and the proving of the existence of ether for it to work. And remember, anything that starts with the word theory is a euphemism for speculation and not a solid fact, which also includes Darwin and his Masonic supporters, which I'll get to later. The world imposed upon us, which has been obscured by deceptions, where we may never be able to fathom, could be one of free energy, longer lifespans, the utilization of natural forces to generate clean, nature-based power, free from a capitalist slave system with time to pursue the meaning of life stuff and maybe explore the idea of ascension to higher dimensions. Add to this the exploration of what we experience other life forms in all of its guises could be, good or bad, and all without the need for a metal craft to go from one point to another. It is then we could be looking at a form of travel normally consigned to the more esoteric views of existence rather than our matter or elemental based limitations explained by the system of slavery we currently endure. Would it be beyond the realms of possibility that science, for the most part, is there to simply back up the theory of existence without any solid evidence to back those assumptions? After all, as I said, Einstein had to completely ignore previous demonstrable facts about the ether in order for his ideas of relativity to be shoehorned into our textbooks. In order to fully comprehend the scale of deception and free ourselves of this fabricated world of physical matter and slavery, we need to go back to the start of what I believe was the modern grand deception. So here is what we are told to believe, written in a way that does not seek to contradict the mainstream narrative, but make it clear what we are told to believe is nothing short of a fantasy. And, as you will see, it's the most preposterous set of fabricated musings which actually form the basis of what we are told is modern science, and one I believe is actually answered within that holographic Hall of Records. So imagine you're sitting in a classroom with the ability to know bullcrap when you hear it, and your first day in school is with the professor of science, and you are now going to learn about the formation of the universe. So here we go, ladies and gentlemen. First came the creation of gaseous nothing forming suns and stars. Then solid pieces of nothing formed moons and planets. Then the nothing forming elements combined, turning hydrogen and oxygen into water on our random chance earthly realm. More random chance then, and the magic happened. A single cell organisms emerged from nowhere and started to divide and multiply, to mutate and grow. These single cells and living organisms transformed to complex sea life, which in turn evolved, replaced their gills with lungs, crawled from the deep onto the land, lost their tails and fins, grew legs, arms, and opposing thumbs. Some mutated and formed wings, and some decided to stay in the water. Okay, let's just stop there for a moment and look a little bit closer at these preposterous claims. According to Le Chatelier, principle of chemistry, life could not have been formed in the sea as evolutionists allege, since the peptide bond created by amino acid chains produced water molecules. So it is not possible for such a reaction to take place in a hydrous environment. So something from nothing is the basis of our current view of all creation. But let us dig a little further into this travesty of logic. In his book, The Evolutionary Deceit, Hiron Yaha explains, evolution theory claims that life started with a cell that formed by chance. According to this scenario, 4 billion years ago, various lifeless chemical compounds underwent a reaction in the primordial atmosphere of the Earth, in which the effects of thunderbolts and atmospheric pressure led to the formation of the first living cell. The first thing that must be said is that the claim that inanimate materials can come together to form life is about as unscientific as you could possibly get, and one that has not been verified by any experiment or observation since. Life is only generated from life. Each living cell is formed by the replication of another living cell. No one in this world has ever succeeded in forming a living cell by bringing inanimate materials together, not even in the most advanced laboratories. The theory of evolution faces no greater crisis than on the point of explaining the emergence of life. The reason it is that organic molecules are so complex that their formation cannot possibly be explained as being coincidental, and is manifestly impossible for an organic cell to have been formed by chance. The whole basis of our existence is founded on unscientific nonsense. And although it may be going a little deeper into the meaning of life stuff here, it is important to understand our fabricated history extends to the deepest parts of our existence and our psyches. This does not negate the idea that we, as a race, were not so much created, but were altered by other, more advanced beings through manipulation of our DNA. However, this does not make those advanced beings anything other than advanced beings, rather than gods that we have come to understand. And the simple reason is because the question of life extends to those advanced beings equally as it does to us ad infinitum. Let's look at how ridiculous these claims of evolution are when looked with an ounce of logic. But for this, we have to ask the question, what is the true nature of an explosion? In this case, the explosion of life, as in the Cambrian explosion of life. But the nature of an explosion is to destroy, to break something. Explosions do not create anything, they only bring chaos from order, never creation. Things that are left to their own devices naturally over time become disordered and deteriorate. All things, whether living matter or not, will eventually decay and die. Oh, and don't worry too much about the dying part, I'm coming to that later. Things don't randomly come together in conjunction with other random things, forming diverse and complex living life forms. The theory of evolution is in direct opposition to the laws of entropy. Evolution supposes things become more ordered, more structured, and more complex over time. But from rust to mould to rotting corpses, nature is everywhere and is at odds with such a preposterous notion. A chap called Malcolm Muggeridge, an atheist philosopher and supporter of evolution for over 60 years, finally admitted before his death that, and I quote, "I myself am convinced that the theory of evolution, especially the extent to which it has been applied, will be one of the great jokes in the history books of the future. Posterity will marvel that so very flimsy and dubious hypothesis could be accepted with the credibility and credulity that it currently has. And just to show you how deep the scientific and academic deception goes, if you've thought that famous find called Lucy was our first ancestor based on Darwin's theory, you would be mistaken and misled yet again. Lord Solly Zuckerman and Professor Charles Oxnard did 15 years of research on Australopithecines, along with a team of 5 specialists, coming to the conclusion that all the various specimens of Australopithecus they examined were only an ordinary ape genus and definitely not bipedal. The French Science and Life magazine ran the cover story in May 1999, Goodbye Lucy, writing about how Lucy, the most famous fossil of Australopithecus, was not the root of human race and needs to be removed from our supposed family tree. But as you probably know, however, even in 2014, with the movie Lucy was released by the Masonic Universal Pictures, where the Lucy ape woman fraud is still treated as scientific fact throughout the entire movie. So just to round off Darwin's flight of fantasy, which has been pushed constantly onto the population of this planet, I think it fitting you should know how it became so popularised and maybe why and by whom, since I can tell you now it was not Darwin himself, since he had no real sway in the Victorian social media, but others certainly did. And for those who say conspiracy theory to mention of a Masonic influence about the movie, it does in point have a fact and a reality basis. In the supporting and acceptance of Darwin's fantastical musings right from the first publications in the 19th century, it was in fact the Masons that pushed it. And I'm going to give you a little background. Freemasonic records state that Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a philosopher, scientist and physician who advanced ideas on evolution back in the 18th century. Before coming to Derby in 1788, Dr. Darwin had made a mason in the famous time immemorial lodge of Canongate, Killywing, number 2 of Scotland. He also maintained close connections with the Jacobin Masons in France and Adam Weishaupt's Illuminati. Sir Francis Darwin and Reginald Darwin, 2 of his sons, were also made Masons in the Tyrian Lodge number 253 at Derby. Charles Darwin does not appear on the rolls of the lodge, but it is most likely that he, like his grandfather, his sons, and his bulldog, Thomas Huxley, was a Mason. Charles wrote that he used to listen to his grandfather's ideas on evolution, so it wasn't even Charles Darwin's idea in the first place, and was greatly influenced by them. Erasmus was the first man to put forward the notion of evolution in England. He was also known as a respected person. Charles himself would go on to marry his first cousin and have 3 children die due to complications from inbreeding, but that's a side note. The Masonic lodges involved in this, thinking that Darwinism could serve their goals, played a great role in its dissemination amongst the masses. As soon as Darwin's theory was published, a group of volunteer propagandists formed around it, the most famous of whom was Thomas Huxley, who was called Darwin's bulldog. Huxley, whose ardent advocacy of Darwinism was the single factor most responsible for its rapid acceptance, brought the world's attention to the theory of evolution in the debate at Oxford University Museum, in which he entered into on June 30th, 1860 with the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce. Huxley's great dedication to the spreading the idea of evolution, together with his establishment connections, is brought into further light according to the following fact. Huxley was a member of the Royal Society, one of England's most prestigious scientific institutions, a bit like the Smithsonian, I would suspect, and, like nearly all other members of this institution, was a senior Mason. Other members of the Royal Society lent Darwin significant support. In short, Darwin wasn't acting alone. From the moment his theory was proposed, or should we say his grandfather's, he received the support that came from the social classes and groups whose nucleus was made up of Masons. But Would it not make a more solid case of Masonic support and propagation of this dark tale of evolutionary fabrication if we actually had the minutes of a Masonic meeting clearly stating the plan to derail our understanding of life? Well, we do. And I quote, "The 33rd degree Supreme Council of Mizraim, Freemasons at Paris, reveals in its minutes its promotion of evolution as science, while they themselves scoffed at the theory." Minutes of the meeting reads as follows. It is with this object in view, the scientific theory of evolution, that we are constantly, by means of our press, arousing a blind confidence in these theories. The intellectuals will puff themselves up with their knowledge, and without any logical verification of them will put into effect all the information available from science, which our agenteur specialists have cunningly pieced together for the purpose of educating their minds in a direction that we want. It goes on to say, do not suppose for a moment these statements are empty words. Think carefully of the successes we arrange for Darwinism. Atheistic Freemasonry in the United States has picked up the resolution of Mizraim from Paris before long. New Age magazine, in its March 1922 issue, stated that the kingdom of atheistic Freemasonry will be established by evolution and the development of man himself. As seen above, the false scientific image of evolution is a deception set in the 33rd degree atheist Masonic lodges. Atheist Masons openly admit that they will use the scientific and the media in which are under their control to present this deception as scientific, which even they found pretty funny. Now, whether you believe in intelligent design, a single creator, or have no idea, the point here is not to push you towards any theory of evolution, rather than simply point out that what we have been given is pure bunkum. Life itself has to have a starting point, and that goes for all life everywhere in the universe. Interdimensional or anywhere else, life in all its forms exist. But is this the basis of what our ancestors could have spent time exploring had they had the time, unlike we who have been subjected to the prison planet we currently are inmates of? If we look at life as a series of levels of understanding, that is to say, a bug or a snail or whatever works on instinct and does what it does without thought of the first or number one dimension world it perceives. It's a flat and level, although it may be aware of the second dimension, which is that of height, come into its awareness. A dog, on the other hand, has an extra dimension of awareness in that it can remember where it hit a bone, and therefore time and memory form part of its mental process. Humans obviously have all the above, and that the perception of space-time and a theoretical understanding of other higher dimensions, but we have an inability to perceive them. Now, I know it's an oversimplification, but it is my way of explaining levels of awareness in those terms. The solution or the answers we seek with the question of creation, of the initial spawning of life, the starting point, if there ever was one, is, I believe, part of those higher dimensions. And as hard as we try to make sense of it, it will always elude us at our present state of awareness. It is this suppression of increased awareness I firmly believe is being encouraged with all the tools available to those in power and at their disposal: media, chemical, electromagnetic pollution, and water infiltration systems. Could our ancestors have had the time to shift awareness to higher dimensions while we get distracted by the restrictive existence created in our current understanding of the world? Could it be part of the biggest deception ever that we have the capabilities, but are constrained by the perceptions of a fabricated world and reality we are currently trapped in? This would also apply to belief systems that require us as individuals to hand over our spiritual well-being to those corrupted middlemen of certain religious organizations. This is not to say religious belief has in and of itself is inherently negative, but the forces in control of religion has proven over and over again throughout history what a destructive force faith has been used for. We should also take note of the fact that it is a religious establishment that has, for the most part, hoarded civilization's ancient knowledge. As I pointed out in my episode on burning history, the Vatican has set itself up as the keeper of ancient knowledge without any permission from the rest of the world. I find it interesting that out of all the organizations which seek to impose their view of the world upon the rest of us, it is a religious order that wishes to protect the knowledge of the ancients, and thus leads me to the inescapable conclusion that the ancient knowledge we seek, and of utmost importance, is based on the idea of an energetic or spiritual type of ascension, or within what we would call the esoteric. Since it would only be esoteric knowledge that would undermine such an establishment, and if our ancestors did have the time in a world of free energy to free all of those 50 shades of slavery, then they would be in a position to travel and maybe even return from realms we can only imagine. Before I conclude this episode, please consider supporting my work by liking, subscribing and sharing this information with anyone and everyone. And for the price of a cup of coffee, you can help keep this channel going via PayPal, Patreon and Bitcoin, all of which are in the description below. Or you can hit the PayPal button up there in the banner above and help support my work. With that being said, let me conclude this episode on a purely philosophical view taken from my own experiences and understanding of life and death. It is probably the biggest question intelligent beings have. Is there life after death? Are we, as spirits or souls, to vacate this physical vehicle and move towards the eternal with a greater understanding of what we have experienced as matter-based beings? When we depart, did we manage to see past the prison we were either placed in or chose to experience and come to know we are eternal life forms or not? What wondrous knowledge sat within those holographic repositories, which are now kept secret and guarded by military forces in different parts of the world? What written knowledge, or any type of knowledge, has been kept from us by the governments and religious houses of the world in order to protect their own views and agendas? The idea of death as a consequence has been with us since the birth of religion. You either go to a happy place or you go to a bad place based on your compliance to social and moral rules of the very organizations that keep our ancestors' knowledge from us. I guess you could call this a sort of imposed spiritual cause and effect, and one that has kept pace with the sands of time by utilizing the death penalty for certain crimes and differing opinions. Many believe death is the final point of existence, and after you die, that's it, nothing, for all eternity. And since you are not aware of it, then why concern yourself about it? It's a bit like being as much aware of life as you had before you were born. But for the moment, let me put aside the death view and look upon life, since it is our observations here that could give us an insight to the flip side of the coin, which I believe is being jealously guarded by religious and military factions. I doubt whether anyone could argue with the following basic facts of science. Energy can only be converted from one type or source to another. Heat, light, explosive force, sunlight to stars exploding, forming and reforming. Everything in the knowable realm of existence is a conversion from one state to another. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, simply converted, sometimes with a destructive power, but never ceasing to exist. So my question would be, what makes us humans think that we are the exception to those universal laws? What drives many to think death is the non-existent state of nothingness some imagine it to be? It would, in all logic, go against what we know to be true of the rest of the universe. And yet, here we sit thinking it's the final moment in our entire existence. The concept of hell and purgatory and heaven in the Judeo-Christian tradition were also based on the premise of consequences. Belief in the afterlife may give the living a more positive view of death, but its main purpose seems to me to be simply to provide threats that if these beliefs of religion are not strictly followed, punishment comes in the afterlife. Personally, I think this view is a direct hijacking of what our ancient ancestors were able to explore for themselves, given the fact that they did not live in a materialistic capitalist world that kept them too busy to ask and explore such questions for themselves. I tend to believe that cause and effect bears no human-based judgment, and we, or as many of us are by nature, morally righteous, and do not require that a middleman to poke his nose in to what can only be speculation on their part of the afterlife. I also find the word afterlife an oxymoron based on the conversion of energy or the idea of ascension. There is in reality no afterlife because life itself cannot be deleted. It may change from one form, but there is no after, since eternal has no before or after. The dwindling ability of our physical vehicle to sustain our life force could be seen as death. But what if we looked at it as what we observed in a slightly different manner without changing the event of conversion itself? So here is another way of viewing what we see on the outside, and let's just flip the coin and use a completely different metaphor. Imagine that in order to survive in this realm, and this realm's environment, should I say, we require a spacesuit. This will sustain us for as long as we maintain it. It can obviously break down like any biological or mechanical system, but for the most part acts as a life force's spacesuit, otherwise known as a body. There will come a time when the suit is worn out, but that has nothing to do with the being inside. Once the suit has passed its sell-by date, we, the life force inside, vacates, ascends, and continues the exploration of existence itself. You may be asking why I even mention this rather philosophical view of life, and the reason is simple. I believe every fabrication, every lie, all the controls and systems currently in place to serve to keep us divided, confused and distracted from the biggest lie of all is exactly that. We are so much more than we give ourselves credit for. We are the gods, I believe, that we look up at the sky for and search, and yet fail to recognize that it is we who have the power of creation, which has, over time, been excluded and denied access to us by those other organizations. The world of our ancestors, the abilities we have lost to time, and the devolution of our energetic abilities seems rather clear to me. Many believe we only use about 10% of our brains, which I think is simply not true. I think the exercising of our minds, which our ancestors obviously had time for, and our spirits, is as important as our bodies and could yield a greater percentage of that brain capacity and of our awareness of those extra dimensions and more control over it over time. We're also told we are constantly evolving, and yet given the advancement many of us believe our ancestors had, it seems to point in the opposite direction. A slow walk towards losing the ability to ascend, to travel interdimensionally, or to create our own future has and is being taken from us in every aspect of our current idea of reality. If we are to turn the tide back towards the essence of life, towards the inherent abilities I think our ancestors and we possess, then we have to start believing in ourselves again, on a deeper level of understanding, on a level that we are currently distracted and distorted from by the few. I do believe we still have the mind and energy to do this, to take that journey for which we were born to take. My reasoning behind our ability to retain the potential to do this is simple. The current powers that constantly attempt to stop us from doing so have not let up in their efforts, and therefore shows me that we have the capabilities within us all, and it still scares the crap out of them if we were ever to realise just how powerful we truly are. Our idea of civilization's prior unity has been removed. The Great Reset is not about changes connected to a point in time, it is about resetting of our mental and spiritual faculties brought about by the deceptions we have experienced. Those abilities have been removed, denied by omission, and steadfastly abhorred by the powermongers of this world, since it would inevitably upset the balance of true power and reset it back to our own realization of the eternal and of ourselves. We are surrounded by toxic logic, which serves only to keep us in the place of a slave-minded race who has no alternative but to obey or die in apathy. The present-time human world is fragmented and stupefied, utterly misled by the grossest kind of deluded thinking about reality itself. The mass populations of the world are being seduced by the absurdities of unsustainable consumerism. Human beings are now and everywhere entrenched in their commitment to absurd consume notions of the potential of absolute self-satisfaction, and are overwhelmed by gross realism views that appears to sanction nihilistic despair and even unlimited and meaningless violence. If you continue to think that we have no alternative, then you are correct. If, however, you begin to see the potential in this grand game within a universe of impossible possibilities, you will realize your shackles are externally encouraged, but ultimately self-inflicted. This episode was put together because I was asked so many questions about many things, and rather than sit and write individual replies, I thought I would put my cards on the table and give what is nothing more than my opinions, and like you are also entitled to them. You may not agree. You may even think I'm a little crazy to have such notions. But before you comment, think about what you believe in, not what you don't believe in. And, at the very least, it will help switch the mind to focus on solutions rather than problems. Whether you believe you can or you can't, you are correct. But it is and always will remain your choice. Remember, the only real currency in this world is time. So please, don't waste it on negative influences. Our ability to imagine and thus create has been hijacked by negative influences claiming sovereignty over our eternal life force, and we cannot allow this to continue or be accepted. My last bit of advice would be to start changing your thought processes and begin to look at life from a detailed solution point of view and back engineer what it is you can do to make that happen in your life. As a creator on YouTube, I can see from the comments what state of mind viewers are in, what place they come from, since many will take the positive approach or even add to what has already been said, and a few will listen only to hear and comment on either disagreement or listen out for mistakes. I leave it to you to consider which one of those you are, since it will control your own journey. In essence, I hope you have found this episode of help and interest, and please feel free to share my work and support my channel by doing so, sharing it that is, or send me a cup of coffee via Patreon, PayPal or Bitcoin. But whatever you choose to do, and whatever you choose to listen to and maybe even comment afterwards, place yourself in a position of solutions rather than problems, and maybe, just maybe, we can all move forward in a world that's been fabricated around us. So until next time, question everything, believe nothing, and stay curious. And I'll see you on deck next week.